So I've been reading Western mainstream media of late. A recent article in Foreign Affairs really spoke disparagingly about Iran's role in West Asia in solidarity with Gaza. There have been talks about Iranian people not so much excited about Iran's strong position in favor of Gaza, in support of Gaza, against Israel's ongoing genocidal assault. So, given that you are in Tehran, you've talked about this a lot on other programs. Could you talk about Iran's role in the resistance to Israel and in its solidarity with the Palestinian people in Gaza and beyond?
Well, I think I'd have to point out that the hostility towards Iran and its support for the resistance is nothing new. And this is not only something that comes from Western sources, but it also comes from Arab sources in the Persian Gulf region, these oil rich family dictatorships that fund a lot of think tanks in the West that have a great deal of influence in the media across Europe and North America. They have the same sort of narrative, and there's a reason for that. They do nothing for the Palestinians, and they have been, in the eyes of many, betraying the Palestinian cause for a very long time. And so when Iran supports the Palestinian cause, they have to find a way to discredit Iran. And so that narrative is understandable. In the West, the same is true. Uh, they want to believe, they want to project the notion that Iranians don't support the Islamic Republic. The regime, as they like to call it, is unpopular. It is despised. It is hated. It is corrupt. And people want to overthrow the regime, as they call it. And that is an understandable position for the West to take as well. In fact, when President Raisi was killed in the helicopter crash, immediately afterwards, there was a lot of talk in the Western media about how Iranians were celebrating and how they were all happy to see him die. And I had a personal experience on the BBC, literally an hour or two after it was stated that he had passed away. I was on the BBC television, and before me, they had these two Iranian American women or Canadian women, and they were saying how everyone is celebrating and how everyone is happy, and people online are celebrating. And after spending maybe 10, 15 minutes speaking with these two people, the journalist finally got to me, the person who's actually living in Iran. And I said, from what I've seen on the streets, in conversations on campus, people are very unhappy. They're very sad. And they were very worried until, because it was a few hours before it became clear that the president had indeed passed away. But then I told him that you're going to see funerals in the coming days, and I expect them to be enormous. And when people come to the streets and there are millions, what are you going to say about all this narrative building that we've been witnessing and that we are witnessing? And so 3 days later, I think it was 3 days later, on the same show, because it was the same hour, I was again invited on the BBC, and I told them that I told the host that, 3 days earlier, this is what happened, what I was saying, and look, people on the streets, millions of people in Tehran, millions of people in other cities. Does this look like a country that is celebrating the death of their president? And the problem, therefore, is, and the Western media has gone silent ever since. They shut down the narrative and moved on to the next topic. But the problem that the West has is that they want to believe these things because they want to believe that their adversaries are unpopular, that they're hated, and that the world wants to be like the West. But that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, it definitely isn't true. So this is nothing new. I've been hearing this for decades. in Iran, the Palestinian people have an enormous amount of sympathy. And I think the funerals themselves are reflective of that, because President Raisi was a very, very staunch supporter of the Palestinian cause. And so, or when General Soleimani was murdered by Trump 4 years ago, we also saw many millions of people come to the streets. And again, he represented Iran's policy towards the apartheid regime. So again, this is nothing new. This has been going on for decades. And I don't expect things to change in the West unless there's some major shift in the political equation in the West or across the world. But Iranians have supported the Palestinian cause from the beginning of the revolution. Those who led the revolution, especially they spoke about the Palestinian cause alongside the cause of the South African people struggling against apartheid. After the revolution, Iran immediately broke off ties with South Africa and the Israeli regime, and they began to fund the resistance. Back then, of course, it was led by Yasser Arafat, and in South Africa by the main group was the ANC and Nelson Mandela. So Iran funded the political wing and the military wing in South Africa of the ANC and other groups, and they did the same for the Palestinian people. And the reason why Iran is so antagonized, the reason why Iran is so has been sanctioned the way it has, is because of its support for the Palestinian people. It really has nothing to do with Iran's peaceful nuclear program or terrorism or anything else. It's really about Iran's foreign policy.
Yeah, and you had an encounter on Piers Morgan where you were confronted with this very phenomenon that you speak of. And I was wondering if you could then talk about, because of course there's a lot of this projection, there's a lot of this demonization of Iran because it does not behave like the West, because it does not follow the West's diktats, and I think the sanctions and all of the targeting of Iran for literal war from the United States and, of course, all of its vassals is proof of this. But could you talk about then, because you said after the revolution, Iran began to support the Palestinian resistance. And I always think to myself, well, similar to other countries that are truly sovereign, if you are actually supporting the right of Palestinian self-determination in a very material way, in a very concrete way, then protest seems to be a very a lower form of support. Could you talk about the concrete ways right now Iran is supporting the Palestinian resistance and how that is affecting the situation in Gaza in this ongoing genocide? But it is a war. I do like to say, even though it's not a war as we may think of it as two militaries facing each other, it is a war in the sense that there's a war of resistance and there's, of course, the genocidal campaign. So could you talk about that?
Yes, sure. And I'd just like to add that it's also a fact that the Iranians were supporting other um, countries that were suffering from US sanctions and dirty wars. So Iran supported Cuba, but I think most importantly, Iran supported Nicaragua during the dirty war in the 1980s when the United States was using the Contra rebels to the right-wing fanatical Contra rebels to undermine the government in Nicaragua. So it's not just South Africa or South African countries and Palestine. It includes places like Nicaragua and Cuba. But uh, the Iranians, I think it would be fair to say that its uh, military involvement or its support for the military wing of the resistance grew gradually. So, for example, in Lebanon, uh, Hezbollah was created during the Israeli invasion of the country. The Israelis captured half of Lebanon, they captured the capital, and they killed anywhere between 30 and 40,000 people. They carried out the massacre in the Palestinian refugee camp, Sabra and Shatila. Between 2,000 to 3,000 people were slaughtered, women and children, in less than 48 hours in that camp by their fascist right-wing allies in Lebanon, but with the support of the Israeli military. It was at that time that Hezbollah was born, and in 1982. And Hezbollah grew during the occupation. And gradually it began to become increasingly powerful, and it forced the Israelis to retreat in phases. And ultimately, in the year 2000, the Israeli regime was forced to retreat from southern Lebanon. So Hezbollah was a national liberation organization, and it was created as a result of Israeli aggression. Also, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as they grew, because we're speaking about the contemporary situation, they gradually got more support from Iran. And so their capabilities gradually expanded. And what we see today, as you rightly point out, is a war in which the Israelis have failed. So there are two parts to this conflict today. One is the genocide, where the Israeli regime is slaughtering innocent civilians out of revenge because they've lost on the battlefield. And the other is the battlefield, where the Israelis have failed. They have failed to control the northern part of the Gaza Strip. They failed to control the central part of the Gaza Strip, and they failed to control the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And they've also failed in the north against Hezbollah as well. And so the Palestinian capabilities, their military capabilities today, are obviously far greater than they were before. And that is, of course, because of their own innovation, their own courage, but also because of Iranian funding, Iranian support, Iranian technology. And so these tunnels that we see across Gaza and across Lebanon and elsewhere, and in Yemen, these are all with the help, obviously, of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's why, for example, just hours ago, the Americans bombed a radio station in Al Hodeidah in Yemen, killing a large number of innocent civilians. They cannot bomb the underground bases of the Yemeni armed forces, or Ansarullah, what they call the Houthis. So the Americans and the British take their revenge on ordinary people or sympathizers. It's the same policy as the Israeli regime in Gaza or in the West Bank or against the Lebanese. But the capabilities that we see today are bearing fruit. The Israelis have lost on the battlefield. There is no escape from this defeat. The longer the war lasts, the worse it is going to get for the regime. Iran will continue to support Hamas. It will continue to support its allies in defending themselves and the people of Palestine, not just in the Gaza Strip, but elsewhere. And the coalition of resistance organizations, or the axis of resistance, they will continue to increase pressure on the Israeli regime to force it to accept a ceasefire. So you're going to see Yemen continue to block ships, and Yemen will continue to enforce the Genocide Convention as they've stated they would. Hezbollah will continue to hit the Israeli regime hard, and it will hit it harder. And the resistance in Iraq and Syria will continue to lob missiles and drones and cause greater damage to the Israeli regime to help decrease pressure on the resistance. But also, the resistance in Iraq will make sure that the Americans feel vulnerable so that they refrain from taking further steps in supporting, or taking military steps in supporting the genocide.
Indeed, indeed. And I know that it's been a very active time for Iran. Of course, with the death of Ibrahim Raisi, the Iranian president. But before this, in April, there was Operation True Promise, which is emblematic of all that you have spoken about. Could you just comment on what was the true impact of that operation? Because even today, there are rumblings in the Western mainstream media talking about this operation as insignificant, as essentially countered. Of course, we know that Iran was trying to prevent a broader war from breaking out, so it was communicating with relevant parties to ensure that there was knowledge, including the United States. But could you talk about the true impact of this operation? Because I think it is often spoken about it and misinterpreted by the collective West, purposefully, in my estimation. But back to you.
Over the years, the Israeli regime targeted Iranians, and it was basically because they were supporting the Syrian armed forces against the extremist groups that were backed by NATO and these oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region and the Israeli regime. So, for example, alongside the occupied Golan, the occupied Syrian Golan, the Israelis were supporting both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda. Both ISIS and Al-Qaeda had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. And of course, ISIS came out of Al-Qaeda. They were one, and then they split. And also, Al-Qaeda, from the very beginning of this dirty war, was working with Americans. We have the famous email that was exposed by WikiLeaks, where Jake Sullivan tells Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. And of course, the same extremist forces were being used in Libya, such as the person who carried out a suicide attack in Manchester. He and his father were working with British intelligence, and they were fighting in Libya. So you have these extremist groups that were working with the West. And so ISIS and Al-Qaeda both had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. And as the Syrian army and their allies would try to defeat them and retake Syrian territory, the Israelis would bomb the Syrians and their allies. They would use helicopter gunships. They would shell them. They would use tank fire. They would treat the terrorists in their hospitals, and they would give them ammunition and food to carry on the fight against the government. And during those years, because Israel wanted to overthrow the Syrian government alongside its partners in NATO and Turkey and Jordan and in the Persian Gulf region, they would target Iranians. But the Iranians did not respond because the Syrian government was in enough trouble as it was, and Iran wanted to keep the focus on Syria. More recently, after October the 7th, when the conflict intensified in Gaza, and Lebanon and Hezbollah joined in the fight to help Gaza, because the Israelis have been forced to keep half of their forces and capabilities in the north, and thus making it much more difficult for them in the fight against Hamas and its allies. The Iranians, of course, were helping the resistance. And so, again, there was a new wave of attacks on Iranian officers. A number of officers were killed. And finally, when the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate, killing a number of officers and a couple of very senior officers, the Iranians decided to respond. I went to the embassy, which I'll get to a bit later. So the Iranians decided to respond because they said that the Israelis have crossed all red lines, and tomorrow they may bomb another embassy or another part of the Iranian embassy in Syria. And this is unprecedented in the world. Never before had an embassy been targeted intentionally, killing so many people before. There was just the case of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, which the Americans claimed that it was an accident, and I think there were 3 Chinese diplomats who were killed. But this was something openly intentional, and the casualties were higher. So in all, I think over the past few months, 19 military officers, including senior officers, were murdered by the Israelis. So after this, the Iranians decided to respond. And they waited a couple of weeks, both because they wanted to carry out psychological warfare, but also there were complicated negotiations going on. Iran wanted to take the issue to the UN Security Council, which they did. And the US, Britain, and France refused to condemn the Israeli regime for bombing the Iranian embassy. And I think that's quite extraordinary. And I think the West really doesn't understand how people across the world and Iranians view the West when they behave in this way. So the Iranians proved to their own people and to the international community, minus the West, but the international community, the global South, the real majority, and increasingly the more powerful part of the international community, they showed them that the true nature of the Israeli regime and their backers. So ultimately, Iran decided to carry out the attack. Iran announced it beforehand, and there was a reason for that. Iran wanted the United States and its allies, all of them, to combine all of their capabilities. So the Americans brought in everything they had. So did the French, the British, the Israelis, of course. And then the Iranians began launching drones, a significant number of drones, over a bit less than, I think, 200 drones. They were older drones, and they announced it. Basically, they openly declared that they are firing these drones, and the reason was because the Iranians wanted the Israelis and the Americans to engage. For three reasons. One is that the Iranians wanted to deplete the Israeli and the American and the European air defense capabilities. According to some estimates, up to $4 billion of missiles were used, and there were roughly $4 billion, $4 million were spent on air defense that night. $1.35 billion by the Israelis, and the rest by mostly the Americans and the other allies. Whereas the Iranians only spent a few, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, or maybe $100,000 or a bit more on the drones. The second reason was that Iran wanted to gather intelligence about capabilities, both Israeli capabilities, but also American and European capabilities. And the third was that these drones were decoys. They were used to keep the air defenses busy so that the missiles could also be fired. So the Iranians fired when the drones reached near their destinations, and the Israelis and the Americans had to down the drones because they all had payloads. So when they were near their destination, meaning Palestine, the Iranians fired a series of missiles. Now, there are broadly speaking, two types of missiles. One was older model missiles. Again, they were kept in storage for many years. Iran wanted to get rid of them, but also they were cheap, and they'd force the Israelis and the Americans again to engage. So it was very expensive for the West, and it also gave more information about their capabilities. And alongside that, the Iranians fired some of their more advanced drones. Their more advanced missiles, not their most advanced missiles, but more advanced missiles. Those missiles, as far as I know, all got through. I've heard friends say that some got through and a couple didn't, but as far as I know, all got through. That's my understanding. So the Iranians hit a military base in the south, which is probably the most protected military air base in the world, where the F-35s were stored, which is used to bomb both Gaza, but also which was used to attack the Iranian embassy. And they also bombed an intelligence base on the Golan, the Syrian Golan, occupied Golan, and damaged that severely as well. So Iran was sending a message to the Israelis and the Americans that we can get through. We can make things very costly for you. And for us, it's very inexpensive and very much worth carrying out. And so the Iranians also warned the Americans that if the Israeli regime responds, that we will strike back heavily. And Iran was prepared to fire 1,700 roughly drones and missiles in a second wave if Israel attacked Iran in a meaningful way. And if that had happened, they would have gotten through, because the Americans did the heavy lifting. The Americans and the Israelis did use everything they had, and according to some estimates, they used half of their capabilities. So if Iran had fired a second wave, most of the drones and missiles would have gotten through, and that would have created major devastation across Israel. And that's why the Israeli regime really didn't carry out a counterstrike. There are three small drones that were used. A number of missiles were fired. Only one entered Iranian airspace and did no real damage to Iran's installations. So the Iranians decided not to retaliate, but they were ready. They were waiting for the Israelis to carry out an attack, to carry out this major second wave of drone and missile strikes. So, and the fact that the Israelis did not respond in any meaningful way against the Iranians, I think itself indicates that the Israelis and the Americans understood that this was not a war that they could win.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.